Hey everybody, welcome to this video, the continued analysis of Much Ado About Nothing. Everything I go through comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to Much Ado About Nothing, available for £3.99 at mrbruff.com, where it contains the complete original text, a line-by-line translation into modern English, and detailed analysis of language, structure, form, themes, etc, etc. So, Act 3, Scene 2 takes place in a room in Leonato's house. Enter Don Pedro, Claudio, Benedict, and Leonato. Don Pedro says, I do but stay till your marriage be consummate, and then I go toward Aragon. So he's telling Claudio, look, I'm only going to stay until the marriage is complete, and then I'm going to go away to Aragon. Claudio says, I'll bring you thither, my lord, if you'll vouchsafe me. In other words, I'll accompany you if you'll allow me. Now, this is obviously a bit of bravado, probably, because he doesn't want to actually leave the second he's got married, but he's, just showing what an all-round nice guy Claudio is. But Don Pedro says, nay, that would be as great a soil in the new gloss of your marriage as to show a child his new coat and forbid him to wear it. I will only be bold with Benedict for his company, for from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot he is all mirth. He hath twice or thrice cut Cupid's bowstring, and the little hangman dare not shoot at him. He hath a heart as sound as a bell, and his tongue is the clapper, for what his heart thinks, his tongue speaks. So Don Pedro is saying to Claudio, no, that would spoil the shine of your new marriage. It would be like showing a child a new coat than saying he can't wear it. And this is obviously pretty sexist treatment of women here, the objectification of Hero. And then Don Pedro is joking and sort of winding Benedict up, saying, I'll ask Benedict to come with me. He's a bundle of fun from head to toe, and he's already cut Cupid's bowstring 2 or 3 times, so there's no longer any danger that rascal would try to make him fall in love with somebody. And his heart is like a bell, with his tongue like the clapper, so he speaks whatever is in his heart. And Benedict says, Gallants, I am not as I have been. In other words, gentlemen, I'm not the person I used to be. Leonato, continuing the wind-up, says, so say I, methinks you are sadder. In other words, I agree, I think you're actually more serious. And Claudio says, I hope he be in love. So, I hope he's in love. Don Pedro says, hang him, truant, there's no true drop of blood in him to be truly touched with love. If he be sad, he wants money. So he's saying, come off it, there's no sincere blood that could be sincerely affected by love in him. If he looks serious, it's because he's short of cash. Benedict sort of bottles out of saying the reality of the situation, that he's now in love with Beatrice, and says, I have the toothache. And Don Pedro says, draw it, pull it out. And Benedict says, hang it. And Claudio says, you must hang it first and draw it afterwards. Don Pedro says, what? Sigh for the toothache. What? Is all this moaning just because you've got the toothache? So he's giving an opportunity for Benedict to admit the situation. And Leonato says, where is but a humour or a worm? In other words, well, that must be caused by an imbalance in the body's humours or by some sort of infection. Benedict says, well, everyone can master a grief but he that has it. So in other words, everybody, thinks pain is fine to handle except the one who's actually experiencing the pain. Claudio, yet say I, he is in love. So they're giving lots of opportunities for Benedict to admit it. He's saying, I tell you, he's in love. Don Pedro says, there is no appearance of fancy in him, unless it be a fancy that he hath the strange disguises, as to be a Dutchman today, a Frenchman tomorrow, or in the shape of 2 countries at once, as a German from the waist downward, or slops, and a Spaniard from the hip upward, no doublet. Unless he have a fancy to this foolery, as it appeareth he have, he is no fool for fancy, as you would have it appear he is. So a bit of clever wordplay from Shakespeare here. Don Pedro saying there's no obvious signs of love in him, unless you count the love he has for dressing in strange costumes, so as to look like a Dutchman today, or a Frenchman tomorrow, or even 2 countries at once, like a German from the waist down with his baggy trousers, and a Spaniard from the hips up with no jacket. Unless you mean he has a love for this kind of foolishness, which his appearance indeed suggests he has, then he is not a fool for love as you claim he is. Claudio says, if he be not in love with some woman, there is no believing old signs. Brushes his hat in the mornings, what should that bode? So, in other words, well, look, if he's not in love, then you can't trust the usual symptoms. He's tidying himself up in the morning. He's brushing his hat. What do you think that means? And Don Pedro saith, hath any man seen him at the barber's? Has he recently had a haircut? Claudio, no, but the barber's man hath been seen with him, and the old ornament of his cheek hath already stuffed tennis balls. So he's saying no, but the barber's assistant has been with him, and the beard hair that used to decorate his cheeks has already been used to stuff tennis balls, so he's had a trim of his beard. Leonardo says, indeed, he looks younger than he did by the loss of a beard, so he does look a bit younger. Don Pedro says, nay, rubs himself with civet. Can you smell him out by that? He rubs perfume on himself. Can't you smell his secret now? And Claudio says, that's as much to say the sweet youth's in love. Well, if we're saying that, then that pretty much as good as confirms the dear boy is in love. Don Pedro says the greatest note of it is his melancholy, with the biggest clue that the fact that he's in love is how sad he is. And Claudio says, and when he wants to wash his face, he knows, when was he known to, and when was he want to wash his face? In other words, well, when did Benedict ever wash his face? He was never somebody who kept himself clean. He must be in love. Don Pedro, yea, or to paint himself, for the which I hear what they say of him. So he's actually taking it one stage further. Yeah, he's wearing makeup. I hear what people are saying about him for doing that. Claudio, nay, but his jesting spirit, which is now crept into a lute string and now governed by stops. What about his free and mocking spirit? It now seems he can be played like a lute. Don Pedro, indeed, that tells a heavy tale for him. Conclude, he's in love. And indeed, this is a great weight of evidence. The conclusion must be he's in love. Claudio says, nay, but I know who loves him. In other words, yeah, and I know who loves him. Don Pedro says, that would I know too, I warrant, one that knows him not. I'd like to know that too. It must be somebody who doesn't know him. So they're just constantly winding up their friend, trying to provoke a reaction from Benedict for their own entertainment. Claudio says, yes, and his ill conditions, and in despite of all, dies for him. So in other words, yes, she knows him, and knows all of his bad qualities, and despite all that, she's still dying to be with him. Don Pedro says, she shall be buried with her face upwards. And Benedict says, yet is this no charm for the toothache? Old Signor, walk aside with me. I have studied 8 or 9 wise words to speak with you, which these hobby horses must not hear. So Benedict doesn't like this banter. He's saying it doesn't cure his toothache, and he turns to Leonardo and says, come on, old man, I want to walk with you. I've got a few words I want to speak to you, and I don't want to say them in front of these clowns. To which Don Pedro says, for my life to break with him about Beatrice. In other words, I bet my life on the fact that they're going to talk about Beatrice. Claudio says, 'tis even so. Hero and Margaret have by this played their parts with Beatrice, and then the two bears will not bite one another when they meet. In other words, I'm sure you're right. Hero and Margaret have done their bit with Beatrice by now, so the two bears won't bite each other when they meet. Now, quite a humorous scene, a very humorous scene, but then in comes Don John, and we'll tackle that in the next video.